Hi, everyone. I'm Marilyn, CEO and founder of Cosmic Centaurs and the host of Center Stage, our weekly video series where we talk about the future of work and learning with some incredible guests every Thursday afternoon at 2:30 p.m. UAE time. Before we begin, as always, give this video a like. Feel free to contribute, ask questions in our comment box. Both myself and Tala, our producer, will be looking for those and making sure to ask Phanish to answer a few of them. Today, we're hosting a discuss segment with Dr. Phanish Puranam. Phanish is a professor of strategy and the Roland Berger Chaired Professor of Strategy and Organization Design at INSEAD. His research in organizational science focuses on how organizations work and how we can make them work better. His current interests include non-hierarchical organizations, the design of informal organizations, and organizational architectures that support self-assembling teams. Besides publishing his research extensively in peer-reviewed journals, Phanish has also written several books. The Microstructure of Organizations offers researchers a new perspective on organization design, Corporate Strategy Tools for Analysis and Decisions, which is used as a reference in MBA programs around the world, and India Inside won critical acclaim for its balanced look at the prospect of India emerging as a global hub for innovation. Phanish obtained his PhD at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania in 2001 and was on the faculty of London Business School since 2012. Reflecting his commitment to doctoral training, he has served as the academic director for the PhD program at both LBS and INSEAD. Phanish, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Yes, I have so many questions for you. The good student in me can't help herself. I feel like I need to make the best of our time together. So let me introduce the topic with a quote from the preface of the ebook that you recently published, the Organizational Analytics ebook, A Guide to Data-Driven Organizational Design, which is freely available for everybody to download. And I do know that you're looking forward to receiving feedback on how you can improve it. So we will definitely share the link in the comments for those who would like to read it. So that quote from that preface says, "Knowing how to organize may be humanity's greatest and oldest accomplishment, but our lives today are also influenced by another more recent human achievement, algorithms." And so today's discussion is centered around data, and specifically organizational data, how it impacts the structure and design of companies and the decisions that we make around them. And of course, the global pandemic in that sense and the great remote experiment have left many executives and teams thinking about their work models, their structure, their culture, but also about how they can use the data that they've been able to collect to make better decisions around them. Being a good student, I read a bunch of your publications, and I know that the way that you think about this is that this data allows us to work around the 3 Ps, which you mentioned in that ebook: our ability to perceive and understand current behaviors, our ability to predict, what they could look like in the future, but also our ability to prototype how our decisions would impact the organizations without actually having to go through another reorg. So without further ado, I have a lot of questions for you about that. And what I love about that quote in the book is that you kind of go back to the fundamentals, right? Organizational design is a problem that has been around forever in different forms for different types of organizations. So maybe before we go to the data side, I'd love for you to kind of go back to, I know you talk a lot about going back to the fundamentals of what it means to design organizations. I'd love to get your brain to download that for us for a minute.
So if I think about organizations, I'm just thinking about any group that has a goal. So that could be a team of a few people, it could be a department, it could be a division, it could be an entire company. So I'm quite agnostic about thinking about all of those as organizations. And the reason being that regardless of the scale or what they do, it turns out that all organizations have the same basic set of problems they have to solve. And the basic problems are really division of labor. How do you convert the goal of that group into something that can be broken down into tasks? And integration of effort. How do you put things back together again? So that's so fundamental that it's universal. It's going to be the case that you have to deal with this in all organizations across all sectors. So that's where we start. And I think where the data comes in is rather than rely on intuition or copying best practice? Could you actually find solutions to these fundamental problems that are context specific, that work for your company, right, for your organization? So that's really the way we want to bring these two ideas together. The problems are universal, but the solutions have to be context specific, and we can use data and algorithms to find good solutions.
So, what is the kind of data that either has been made available because of the pandemic or perhaps has increased in accuracy that you feel we can now really focus on in order to make those decisions?
So historically, the data in the people space, right, has been always lagging the data on markets or data on customers or on finance or on accounting or supply chain. So what kind of data was there? Well, we had personal records. We had data on how people progress through the system over time. Did they meet their KPIs? Were they getting promoted? How much were they getting paid? We had some data on things like networks, but it mostly came from running surveys. And those were painful, right? I mean, I've tried collecting them myself, and it's not easy to do at all. And then, of course, there was some further interview-based data on culture, sometimes survey-based data on culture. So broadly speaking, these were our sources of data. Now, what has changed, I think, because of the pandemic is one simple fact. It forced all of us to work remotely. And working remotely means working digitally, which means you leave a digital trace of the same activities that you were doing earlier with no trace. So now, because most of our interactions are happening in formats like the one we are in right now, right, or on Zoom or on Slack or Microsoft Teams or things like that, effectively you have an electronic record of the way the organization actually works. That's been like a complete fire hose of data, which we have never had in this field. So just in the last year, I think organizations have now more data about how they actually work than they probably ever had in their history. So this is the golden opportunity that I think we were all waiting for, because we had the ideas, we had the algorithms, we had the technical skills, we didn't have the data. Now we have the data. So that's what makes it, I think, so special.
Yeah, and I think that now we also have, we have more faith in the accuracy of the data. Recently, I was talking to one of our colleagues, Rajat. He was telling me that in one of his previous roles, he actually had, just for timesheets, so we're not even talking about every other thing, he had a person, half of their time was spent on validating the accuracy of time spent. Right? And so you had data, but if you wanted to make decisions based on them, you weren't sure whether that data was actually good enough for you to do that. Do you believe that this is now a problem that, at least for this period, we can put behind us?
It certainly improved a lot, right? In part because the necessity of the data being good enough has risen to such a critical level. One just cannot work, in the sense one can't schedule a meeting, right, without knowing who's going to attend, how long they're going to spend in it, what are the follow-up action items. So lots of stuff that people assumed could happen in the corridor, right, or an informal conversation, now has to be documented. Now that has both pros and cons, and we can talk about the cons later. Right now, the pro is the data quality has improved enormously compared to anything in the past.
And so now comes kind of the second half of that quote we earlier mentioned, which is the algorithm part. So you talk about how those algorithms, as you mentioned in the book, they can help us with perception. So starting to have a true data-driven, less biased understanding of how our organization works, using the data of the past to also predict how it will look like in the future, but also potentially prototyping. Talk to me a little bit about the three kind of chapters of how algorithms can support.
Okay, so I'm going to take examples from some very basic issues in organization design at the individual level, which is really around HR issues. So let's take the issue of diversity and inclusion. Does our company have a D&I problem? Now, this is a question that can be very controversial. You can get very politicized around it. You can get very hot and angry about it. But there's nothing like some data actually showing you what's going on. Okay, so one of my former students from our MBA program has been running this program at Grab, where they went through this exercise of actually looking at the data and trying to understand where is the imbalance. So at what levels in the hierarchy do you start seeing an imbalance between men and women, and why, right? So there's nothing like a ton of data to take all the passion out of the discussion and make it a rational scientific decision. Because for the most part, most people want to improve D&I. It's just that without good data, you can't have that conversation. This is what I call perception. And to be honest, you don't need more algorithms than what you see embedded in Excel. So this is table stakes. This was big data. What's new now, I think, is using big data to go beyond perceiving what's happening to being able to make predictions. That's where machine learning comes in. So machine learning is a prediction technology. And using this data, we can, for instance, make a prediction who's likely to quit the company in the next 12 months, who's at risk of attrition, right? Who's likely to do better if placed in a particular role? Who's likely to take this career path versus that? Which teams are likely to function better based on how we compose them? So these are forecasts in some sense. And like all forecasts, we make them based on the theory that the past is sufficiently like the future to be able to make this leap. Again, that's not always a good assumption, but often it's the best we have, right? And we have the data now to actually make that assumption, look at the results and see are they working well or not. So that's prediction. And finally, the cutting edge here is not really machine learning. The cutting edge is prototyping. The idea here that we can do A/B tests. So much like the pharma companies are testing out vaccines right now, where we have clinical trials. So through randomization, we can have treatment and control groups. We can try it in one group and leave the other group untreated, look at the difference, and then we know for sure that if we see a difference, it must have been because of the intervention, right? And to design these kind of studies, the traditional way to do it is do it at big scale and use a lot of randomization, and that creates its own political challenges. Machine learning can actually help us to create what I call almost experiments. So it's not really an experiment in the sense you don't truly randomize. What you do is you find people who are statistical twins of each other. Right? So let me give you a concrete example. I want to figure out, is there value in sending somebody to INSEAD for an exec MBA? Okay, let's assume that a client company is making this call, right? And the client is paying for this. How do they know? So if you're a large organization, one way you might do this is to run a randomized controlled trial. You take 100 managers who are eligible to go, send 50 of them at random, that's important, right? And then compare the career progression of these 50 with the 50 who didn't go. Now, you can see immediately how controversial this is going to be, right? This is a non-starter for most companies. But what we can do is we can send whoever wants to go, is available to go, and so on, and then use the models that we have to find their statistical twins in the company who didn't go. These are people who, on average, are the same gender, the same age, the same career trajectory. So that becomes the control group. So what the algorithms are doing is finding us better matches between the two. So I think each of these examples shows you what one can do with data and with algorithms, which you couldn't have done in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like the geek in me is like completely thrilled by this, but the skeptic in me is also wondering how old does a company need to be for this to work, or how many years of data do you need to have accumulated so that the data of the past is a sufficient predictor of the future? That's my first half of my question. I guess the second half is also, you talked about designing experiments. So where you can, for example, within a company, suppose, I don't know, go from a functional organization to a multidisciplinary team, suppose. How do you negotiate the politics around running these experiments? And how have you seen companies, if you've conducted these exercises with them, communicate about them?
So there are a couple of different ways around it. One is to actually run a proper experiment and get approval from people at the top to do it. I haven't done one of them myself, but I know colleagues who have. And it is a very complicated process of getting approvals and sign-offs and so on. So there are a couple of other alternative paths which can lead us almost there, not quite all the way there. One of them is the idea of combining gamification with experiments. Okay, so here's how it works. And I know this is actually something I've seen done and I've used it myself as well. Suppose we have exactly the question you're asking. I want to decide between teams which are functional experts or teams which are composed of cross-functional experts. Which would be better in our context? Now, I can show you 100 academic articles arguing the first is good, and I can show you another 100 arguing the second is also good. And they're all right. Just right about different contexts, right? In your context, which is the right way, we'll never know until we run the test. So how do we do it? We could run a full-fledged experiment. That's going to be costly. But the alternative is we find a task that these teams do, which resembles what they do in their real life, but in fact can be done in a couple of hours. That's the gamification, right? So suppose these teams are doing claims processing, for example. So we should be able to find like a mini case which involves making a claims processing decision, which you can do in 2 hours. Now, in real life, you might spend a day on it, but now you can do it in 2 hours. So once we have this mini task, we can actually create a gamified environment where we take 50 teams, put them in the function structure, 50 teams, put them in the divisional structure, run the same task, run it in the morning before lunch, and by evening, we have the results. right? So this is the idea of thinking of organizational design using a wind tunnel analogy.
I was sharing the experience that I had with, I believe, a very similar gamified experience that you ran early on in the pandemic, where I was part of this group of INSEAD students. We signed up for, we were wanting to learn about remote work. And one of the biggest things that are contested in remote work is whether creative work is possible in a distributed setting. And I was part of a group of students who contributed, I guess, as a test case to a gamified, as you say, mini task, which was we had to write the brief for an event. And it turned out that you had divided us into two different groups. And the difference between them was how we could communicate with each other. So in one situation, I was the lead, so I could talk to the different team members, but they couldn't see what the others were writing. And in a second one, everybody could chat together. And I guess you were then going to look at the quality of the output, whether we managed to accomplish the task or not, perhaps the quality of the conversation, and then be able to start thinking about, is collaborative work possible in a distributed setting? Actually, how far did you go in that research?
So that study is now complete, actually. And again, I was making the point about wind tunnels. So you could always say, how close is that to reality? Yeah. Right? And it's not perfectly like reality, but it's pretty informative. So what we learned is that these systems where everybody could talk to everybody in the teams, they produced a lot more ideas, but the ideas were a lot less creative. So they produced numerically many ideas, but it wasn't the case that these ideas were that different from each other. The teams where there was actually a restriction on communication, right, produced fewer ideas. People were less happy in those teams, but the ideas were quite novel. They were quite divergent. So this is actually pointing to potentially a dark side of Slack. We've all gotten used to Slack, where everybody can see what everybody's saying all the time. The problem that creates is it may create a degree of conformity, because you've already seen what others are saying, so your thought gets shaped in a particular direction. And that's kind of a hidden cost of Slack we wouldn't have known without running the experiment.
That's brilliant. I recently read an article around Standups as well. I think Google ran a bit of research on teams that do or don't perform daily stand-ups, and found out that teams that do have them tend to be less creative, or at least less innovative, meaning they tend to have less ideas that are more groundbreaking. And they attributed that to the need to deliver something on a daily basis. And so the pressure to deliver on a daily basis meant that you couldn't go on like creative, roundabouts that might take you a couple of weeks or even longer, and so reduced your ability to innovate. As a consequence, in our team, we tell our team members that they have, if they come to a stand-up and they haven't done anything, all good, we don't care, it's fine. Just come to hear what other people have done, and that's fine. So I also know that you teach MBA students, and you have an elective around what are kind of the tools and the skills that you need to acquire if you're going to be able to run and truly analyze this kind of research. I wondered if you'd be able to talk to us a little bit about that as well.
Sure. So the person who really understands data science and also understands organizations is like your mythical Centaur, right? It'd be great to have one, but we don't see them walking around. So they're a rarity. So what we can do is we can find people who know enough about one of these and a bit about the other, so they can talk to experts across the divide. So that's what we try to create in my class. So we have an elective at INSEAD called Org 2.0. And what we're training is organizational design experts, but who know enough about data science to be able to use data scientists to help them make these decisions. So the skills we are teaching them is really how to consume data science analysis. So they don't write code themselves. We write the code and run the analysis. But their task is to kind of look at the results, ask the right question, put the fear of God into their data scientists is the way I pitch the class. So that's what I help them learn how to do. And that can be taught very fast.
Yeah, I think, in fact, that's often, in most organizations that I've worked with, whether as their consultant or even as a member of the team, there may be data. If we're lucky, there's a couple of data scientists on the teams. But then when the sort of business side of the company looks at the data, oftentimes they don't have the right reflexes or the right way of understanding it, or they can't tell if it's good or bad. They don't know what the baseline is. So there's a lot of really fundamental things that we don't understand about data, which lead us to think we're making a data-driven decision, but in fact we're not. Are there any top 3 tips that you tell people, look, these are the 3 stupidest things that you could do with data, stay away from it, or just be careful? Like I always say, averages are for suckers. That's a bit aggressive, but that's to say that averages kind of take out the stories of what's happening on the edge. And if you only look at that, then you might miss an opportunity for innovation or for asking yourselves interesting questions. Are there any kind of like bite-sized advice that you give?
Yeah, so for each of these, we could mention one. So if it's about perception, right, which is just using data to understand what's going on, then I like your averages are for suckers. To that, I would also add, you need to ask, what data am I not seeing? Right? The problem is the things that get measured get focused on, but it could be that there are important issues that are not in the data because the data wasn't collected that way, and you'll never come to know. So what are the dark spots in the data? That's an important question. If you get to prediction, I think this is where the risk of being led astray is particularly high right now, because the technologies have moved very fast and most people don't understand them. So people can come and tell you we have a 92% accuracy rate in our model that makes predictions on who's going to exit, right? That sounds impressive until you realize that the turnover rate in the company is actually 8%, which means that if you just predicted nobody quits, you're only going to be wrong 8% of the time. That means you will have a 92% accuracy rate. So you don't need a model for that. So knowing what it is that the model is adding beyond what we already knew how to do, that's the crucial question. So you got to set the horse race between what were we doing with human judgment versus what the algorithm is doing. And unless you run the horse race, you can't really tell if you're winning. Similarly, with these experiments, so a lot of these experimental trials in the corporate world, they use the term experiment, but they don't have randomization. And if you don't have randomization, I'm sorry, it's not an experiment. So one of the worst ways you can run an experiment is the following. Let's say you have a new initiative and you want to pilot whether it's going to work. So who gets to pilot it? The people who are the most enthusiastic about it. So they sign up and you say, okay, go ahead and pilot it. This is the absolute worst thing you can do. The reason is these guys will do well, but they're not representative of what's going to happen when you roll it out. So it has to be randomized. So I think each of these are fairly common pitfalls.
Yeah, that's a very absolutely valid point. I'm researching, a 4-day work week, just to see, like, I was reading this morning a few academic papers on the topic. And as you say, there's always going to be somebody says there's 10 papers that say, oh my God, it's amazing. And then there's 10 papers that say it's crap. Something interesting that I read, and you're making me think back to that this morning, is that if you measured after 1 month or 6 months or 12 months, there was some kind of like not recency bias, but more like enthusiasm for the new initiative. That meant that in the early days of the measurement, everybody kind of said really good things about the 4-day work week. But 6 months or 12 months later, a lot of the indicators that had been rated very positively suddenly stopped being such a big differentiator. I guess that's another one of those effects, right? Which is that you have to keep measuring. And maybe that brings me back to that earlier question, which is like, what kind of period is kind of in human behavior, because that's really what we're looking at in the end, is good enough?
So it's going to vary by question, right? So I'll give you 2 examples from my friends at Google. So I work quite closely with them on various things. So they've been running this project called Project Oxygen, which is very famous, I think, in our industry, right? Everybody's heard of Project Oxygen. So this is really about 8, and I think it's now become 10 dimensions on which good managers excel. So when they first did that, there was obviously the question that may have been true 10 years ago. Is it still true today? So what they've ended up doing is to update that every 4 or 5 years. And that's really important for them to do because they use this now across the entire company, all around the world, to evaluate every manager, and it affects their pay. So when it's that consequential and it's that global, it's got to be up to date. Now, Google also runs A/B tests on deciding what food to put in which part of the kitchen. So they have all these work kitchens, and they actually have run A/B tests to figure out how can we put the high calorie stuff at the bottom so that it discourages people from snacking on unhealthy foods. So they run A/B tests on this because it's a very data-driven company. But that's obviously going to change if you change who you're hiring, right? If you have a bunch of people in their 20s, the results you get will not hold for people who are in their 40s or 50s, right? For me, if it's like on the 4th floor below, I'm not going to touch it. So, but somebody much younger might not be deterred. So that has to be something that you tune on probably in a much faster frequency. So it's really going to vary question by question. There isn't like one generic answer.
Yeah, I definitely agree. In the course of our work, we always insist on both speaking to people and running surveys. And when clients say, why do you need to speak to 30 human beings? Obviously, it's a lot of my time too. And I'm like, because if I just run the survey, I won't be able to understand the story behind it. And I might come to you and say, look, clearly this thing is useless, while in fact the reason people don't use this process, or the reason they, don't adhere to this, is it hasn't been explained, right? And if we don't know that, then we can't figure it out.
So not only do the interviews and the direct interaction put some texture on the results of this analysis, I would actually go a step further. I would say even if the interviews actually shed no light on the statistics, they're pretty useful, because ultimately the consumers of our results, they like stories, right? People are very into listening to stories and telling stories. So there's actually a role now on LinkedIn, you can Google it and find one, called Chief Data Storyteller. This is a thing, right? You can be a chief data storyteller. So it's a skill. So you actually need to be able to tell the results of your analysis in a narrative that people can buy and then act on. And I think interviews can really help create that narrative. So I don't see those going away anytime soon.
I love that job title. I'm going to steal it. And so you told us a few examples about Google, but I believe like these are things that they were doing even before the pandemic. Have you seen any interesting similar kind of using data and algorithms in companies as a consequence, or following the pandemic? And what do you think those examples or any of the work that you're doing means in terms of what does organizational design look like in the future?
So I cannot name the two organizations I'm working with right now. This is still confidential. But there are two fairly well-known organizations. One is in education. One is in the life sciences R&D. What they've both done essentially is given us access to their entire servers of data on Microsoft Teams meetings, Zoom meetings, and email logs. Now, just to be clear, we go through a very rigorous process of data protection and confidentiality. So we do not get to identify anything at the individual level. But what we have is this data which starts from before the pandemic hit and then continues right up to the middle of 2020. The point of this is to use the data to figure out how did the organization adapt to the need to work remotely? Who are the central actors who kind of integrate different people together across geographies? Who are the people who need to be co-located when you can go back to work? And who are the ones who can actually continue to work in a distributed way, right? This is exactly the question they're asking us to investigate, and we can actually answer that because we now have the data to do it. This is going to be extremely important going forward, because I don't think any company wants to anymore consider the default option being one where all their employees show up all the time. That's just not on the table. I don't see that, right? So then the question is, who should come and when? And rather than just make it based on alphabetical order or employee number or seniority or something, you might want to say which groups of people are coherent, who work together. And you can see that in the data. So that's really the direction we want to go.
Yeah, actually, one of our first clients asked us just this question without giving us the data. So we had to go to academic work, but we had to help them understand the integration role, because we often tend to overestimate the productivity of people who deliver things we can see. But we forget the MVP. I call them the Scottie Pippins, even though Scottie Pippen was an incredible, athlete in his own right, but he was also the guy who brought the team together. And without him, Michael Jordan was amazing, but the team wasn't kind of integrated in the right way. And so we often forget those personas. And if we look at productivity as just output, and we forget the human aspect of collective action, then sometimes we might underestimate those people and maybe cut in the wrong place if that was the intention, or simply not bring them back in the office when we should have. So I think it's incredible that these organizations are actually looking at that and considering it. And Phanish, I guess that brings us to our last question of the day. And it's a question that we ask all of our guests. So I'm going to ask you to complete a sentence and then explain the choice of words. So the sentence is simple. It's the future of work is?
Interesting.
Interesting. Why is it interesting?
So I think we are standing at the cusp of some phenomenally interesting opportunities that are interesting in the sense it can lead to some amazing outcomes. There's also some real risk. It can lead to some really dystopian outcomes, right? Maybe I'll quickly highlight a couple. I think one can make a case that now that we've learned to work distributed, remote working should be the eco-friendly default option. Right? We're saving so much in terms of carbon emissions if we just learn to cut down on commuting and business travel. That's the positive. The negative is we might end up with organizations where people don't interact anymore face-to-face. They work through avatars. The concept of an organizational culture sounds archaic. Right? So which fork we'll take, I can't. And the same is true for digital as well, right? So having worked remotely, it means we've worked digitally. Now there's this mountains of data that we've been talking about. We can use that to improve the way we work. or we can turn every company into a panopticon where everybody is being monitored and surveilled to death. So again, I don't know which path we'll take, right? That's the reason I use the word interesting. So there are two outcomes in these situations, and which one will adapt will really come down to leaders and their vision.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful word of warning. And every, it's like watching Black Mirror. Every technology can start off, having a wonderful, mission and then be distorted or transformed. And as humans, we do have a choice about how we use our technology. And I think that's a beautiful way of closing it, which is to say that while we believe in the power of tech, we also have a human choice around how we implement it and the decisions we make around it. So that was a beautiful way of closing the session. Thank you so much for joining us and teaching me so much in the span of 30 minutes, which is incredible. I think you've given me a lot to think about and a lot to ponder on. And a huge thank you to our attendees as well for tuning in and engaging. I did see a few comments here and there. I might pick up on one just because it would promote someone from the industry, and I'd love that. So Andrew Blaine mentioned that Sam, who's on the call, who's following us, has a software called teamform.co, and he's been doing something similar to the work you're doing with those two companies in Australia with a company that has 20,000 staff. So it might be worth it to reach out to him. And thank you, Andrew, for highlighting that. And so we will, of course, be reposting the video. It's always available on LinkedIn. So if anyone wants to share the link with somebody or rewatch it, you can do that. Please do follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. We do post pretty cool content. Tala and I work very hard on that. And we'd love to get your thoughts on everything that we do. Do subscribe to our newsletter as well. I look forward to seeing all of you in our next episode, same time next week, where we'll be speaking to Helen Uzaizi about how she brings entrepreneurship into education for youth. So be sure to tune in. That's Thursday, February 18th at 2:30 p.m. Dubai time. Thank you so much again for everybody who joined us, signing us off, and see you next week.